Welcome to the Atlantic Forum Spring Conference. My name is Jeffrey Hoevenagel and I am the conference chair. Today we face an uncountable number of complex challenges in a multifaceted threat environment, ranging from disruptive technologies to climate change. However, all challenges still remain, while emerging threats are developing at a rapid pace, such as the hypersonic missile. Over the past decades, we have seen the exponential use of influence operations, disinformation, and hybrid warfare. The threat landscape has far become more complex and shrouded in a fog of war, where lines have been blurred between unconventional and conventional warfare, highlighting challenges such as lawfare and the use of gray zone strategies. Here are just a few examples to paint you a picture. In the South China Sea, China has been using commercial fishing boats as a means to intimidate and repel activities of any country that challenges its territorial claim over the region. Russia utilizes the Gerasimov doctrine, combining different military, political, cultural, and economic strategies all in one. China's version is its three warfares, a strategy utilizing psychological, media warfare, and legal warfare, or better known as lawfare. I want to say that Mark Leahy will discuss these topics regarding China and Russia in depth tomorrow morning, so do not miss out. Adding on that, in 1999, two Chinese colonels published a book entitled Unrestricted Warfare, outlining how to defeat an superior adversary, both in economic and military terms. The book stated, the great masters of warfare techniques during the 21st century will be those who employ innovative methods to recombine various capabilities so as to attain tactical, campaign, and strategic goals. The reference to innovative methods also includes economic strategies. COSCO, a Chinese company, has taken control of the port of Piraeus, which provides many challenges on critical national infrastructure and implications on military mobility, or military Schengen, as it's better known, as the risk of outside interference is high. Non-state actors have utilized non-conventional methods greatly over the past decades, as we have all seen. All these threats, challenges, signifies one thing: that state and non-state adversaries are willing and able to commit to non-conventional means. The current pandemic has shown our strengths and sadly our weaknesses. However, it's not a new security threat. It's not the first or last. The pandemic is a faceless threat with no conceptual antagonist. The world has suffered through the plague and the Spanish flu. However, we see another side of the pandemic, which is the war of narratives. The weaponization of words is a devastating tool as part of hybrid warfare. COVID-19 has hit national budgets reasonably hard, which will impact defense spending, especially to the commitment of 2% GDP by 2024. We also must not forget our old and current challenges, such as NATO's eastern and southern flank, cyber attacks, terrorism, and the challenges posed by non-state actors in North Africa and the Middle East. Emerging technologies, particularly artificial intelligence, are a game changer in security and defense, with many different applications. AI can forever change the very nature of warfare itself. Will AI remove the soldier from the battlefield? Only time will tell. The legal, political, and ethical considerations are immense, considering autonomous weapon systems and machines. BAE Systems Tyrannis, an unmanned combat aerial vehicle, projected to enter British service in 2030 and is still in development, showcases the recent developments in autonomous systems and stealth technology. But we are still far from full autonomy. AI is more of enabling technology, enhancing current capabilities. Regardless of anyone's stance, AI will undoubtedly save lives, especially in the field of explosive ordnance disposal. Furthermore, we have to take into account a lot of factors about the future landscape. Population growth, with a projection of a total of 9.8 billion people by 2050, as well as an aging population. Environmental challenges such as climate change and the consequences such as intense storms, rising sea levels, loss of biodiversity, and habitat destruction contribute to food scarcity and access to drinkable water, all of which will increase the global competition of resources. The world is currently at a crossroads. We need to adapt and innovate to be prepared for tomorrow's challenges. Martin Dempsey stated it best in 2014 in the Quadrennial Defense Review. He stated, "My greatest concern is that we will not innovate quickly enough or deeply enough to be prepared for the future, for the world we will face 2 decades from now." Dempsey urged Congress to implement difficult decisions and remove limitations to allow hard decisions. Dempsey's message also applies to all of us, because security starts with oneself. We are only as strong as our weakest link, meaning we need to invest in defense to improve our resilience and capabilities to respond to current and future threats. I discussed non-conventional threats and hybrid warfare earlier before, where adversaries seek to divide et impera. Adversaries, state and non-state actors, will take advantage and exploit weaknesses in our societies. More than ever is there a strong need to reinforce international democratic solidarity, and unity to act on our common interests. We are only stronger together. The pandemic has shown the strong need for a united front and a need for far greater cooperation. It also forces us to rethink resilience, which is enshrined in Article 3 of the Alliance Founding Treaty. Resilience is not just in defense, but in our society. Strengthening societal resilience is an opportunity to engage with different facets of society to create a stronger and inclusive strategy. The pandemic is an opportunity to reflect on biological threats and how can we be better prepared for the next biological calamity. Would it be through enhancing CBRN capabilities or engaging with different organizations and building partnerships to share knowledge and experience? Engagement and dialogue are one of NATO's strengths because it's far more than a military and political alliance. It's a community of values, bringing people together. Former US Secretary of State Dean Acheson stated, "The central idea of the treaty is not a static one. The North Atlantic Treaty is far more than a defensive arrangement. It's an affirmation of the moral and spiritual values which we hold in common. We must remember, if state and non-state actors are willing to undertake asymmetric strategies to gain a competitive advantage, it is a testament on how strong NATO truly is." As NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg stated, NATO allies are 50% of the world's GDP and 50% of the world's military might. The Atlantic Forum's spring conferences addresses many of these topics, covering the need to adapt to an ever-changing world. Hybrid warfare, intelligence, maritime security, space, and the tensions in the South China Sea are all discussed. Each panel will provide you with an in-depth analysis and unique insight into their respective topics. This conference is your one-stop shop to get the latest updates on the current challenges the security and defense community faces, and discuss the opportunities and way forward. We've brought an unprecedented number of high-level subject matter experts from a range of different organizations, including the EU and NATO, and so much more. Importantly, the Atlantic Forum has made a truly remarkable event by bringing in experts from both sides of the Atlantic. We've invited speakers from the United States, such as the US Naval War College and the National Defense University. Importantly, the Atlantic Forum embraces youth, including young professionals. We provide a platform where your voice will be represented and heard. Our conference truly embodies this, as all our panels include young professionals. The conference is divided into 3 days, kicking off the discussions on NATO 2030, and its external relations and dimensions. Day 2 will focus on the following themes: lawfare, counterterrorism, intelligence, and space. Day 3 will focus on climate change, the Arctic, the South China Sea, and a special presentation on intelligence. As you are watching this, you have the unique opportunity to engage with the speakers throughout the conference. First, you can provide your questions in our live stream's comments section on both Facebook and YouTube. Second, Atlantic Forum's patrons will have a dedicated Zoom room to discuss and network behind the scenes. They will also have access to Slido to ask their burning questions. If you are interested in becoming a patron, do not hesitate to visit the Atlantic Forum's website for more information. On behalf of the Atlantic Forum and the conference team, I would like to thank all the speakers for accepting our invitation. Without you, this conference would not have happened. Sharing a personal story that many have experienced, your contribution to the conference will not just educate people, but also inspire them, inspiring young professionals to go to new unexplored fields, to explore different career opportunities they have not thought initially. I want to thank the Atlantic Forum, the founders Igor and John, as well as Maria and Elena. Importantly, I would like to thank the Atlantic Forum's conference team for making this all happen. Your hard work has brought us here to this moment. So thank you, Petra, Shari, and Paula, for leading us to success. Join us on embarking on this 3-day journey to explore the fascinating topics that are changing the world currently. And do not forget to share this live stream with your friends and colleagues. Now let us start with welcoming our keynote speaker. 3, 2, 1. I would like to welcome NATO Deputy Secretary General Mircea Geoană to the Atlantic Forum Spring Conference. Mr. Geoană, thank you for joining us live from the NATO headquarters. We are honored for you to be here, and I would like also to thank our friends at NATO Public Diplomacy Division for supporting this event. Ambassador Geoană, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jeffrey, it's a great pleasure to speak once more at the event organized by the Atlantic Forum. I congratulate you and your colleagues for a wonderful program all over the weekend. But I wanted to get back to you and speak again with you and your colleagues, because part of the responsibility of leadership is to prepare those who will one day follow in your footsteps, take up the mantle and shape the world, hopefully for the better. This is why the Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, and I myself, we take every single opportunity to reach out, to speak with those at the beginning of their careers, and encourage them, and encourage you to stand up and be vigilant and be active in defending the values that NATO has defended for so long: our freedom, our democracy, and the rule of law. Last year, for this pivotal speech on the security implications of climate change, Secretary General Stoltenberg chose to speak with a network of 10 universities all across the alliance. In November, we organized NATO's first ever youth summit, and we invited 14 young leaders to formally contribute to the NATO 2030 initiative, which today is taking shape on the way to the NATO summit in June. These young leaders share their ideas and advice on how to shape our alliance in the decade ahead. Your voice matters, your intellect and your fresh ideas do matter, and we are always on the listening mode from our side of this partnership. Later this year, the first intake of NATO's Young Professionals program will begin their NATO careers. For 3 years, these 12 young leaders will work across different parts of this large organization of ours in different countries, gaining an insight into what NATO has to offer, and in the process, make a genuine contribution to keeping our nations and our peoples free and safe. Because NATO is committed to diversity and inclusion, regardless of gender or race or sexual orientation or background. And I encourage you all to look out for the next recruitment round when it comes. We need and we encourage fresh young talent to join our ranks. But one of the reasons we are so keen in reaching out to young people is because the alliance we represent is an alliance of democracies, and the trust and support of public opinions is paramount to everything we do, and especially with the younger generations who have not lived during the Cold War or the long transition that countries in Eastern Europe have witnessed. The young leaders, the young generation may question which is the raison d'etre of this alliance, which is already 72 years old. Only last Sunday, we celebrated our 72nd anniversary. I think the answer is quite clear. In a turbulent world of intense geopolitical rivalry and multifaceted and intertwined threats to our security, peace, and prosperity, NATO is more relevant than ever. And our common values and interests on one side, and the permanent adaptation to a changing world on the other, have been always and are today and will be in the future the ingredients of the most successful alliance in history, yesterday, today, and tomorrow. It is our common sacred obligation to continue on that constant path of adaptation. The world never stops. History never stops. Change is always there. But we have been so successful over time because we have been so agile, and we have in our DNA code this permanent adaptation gene. And I have to say that we always have to also be open not only to agility, but also to new ideas and fresh ways of thinking and working. Because doing a better job inside NATO and adapting to a changing world outside of NATO, this is again key to our enduring success. We can never stand still because the world around us moves too fast. And see today the myriad of complexity around the security situation in Europe and around the world. Russian militaristic adventurism, the rise of China, deep changes that cyber, hybrid, resilience, space, and emerging and disruptive technologies, and yes, the security implications of climate change, all at the same time are bringing challenges, but also the obligation of NATO to permanently adjust. And this is why the sacred mission of NATO to protect and defend the peace, security, and prosperity of the 1 billion people that live in NATO allies in the 30 nations in our alliance is the sacred oath that we all have and is the fundamental mission of this alliance. Of course, at times, this bewildering melange that now makes our reality can test our very beliefs, our own citizens' trust and faith in governing systems. It can test our resilience as communities, societies, or individuals, as human beings. But yes, indeed, they also transform the very definition of security. The challenges are too big for any country, or any continent for that matter, to face those alone. But together, through NATO, the nations of Europe and North America, we are not alone. And together, we must continue to adapt, to be ready to face, and will be ready to face, any challenge that might arise. This is, in fact, what the NATO 2030 initiative is all about. And we are so happy that we had input from young leaders and young generation, because this is the way to future-proof our alliance. From all these big facets of security today, I would like to choose two, because I believe they are relevant, not only for NATO, but for us, for you, for our democratic societies, because they also have a defining impact on how the alliance adapts towards the next decade. I will speak a little bit about resilience and then about technology. First, resilience. Later this year, NATO leaders will come to Brussels in person for the first NATO summit to agree an ambitious and forward-looking transatlantic agenda. This means having a stronger, more responsive, and more sophisticated military. But increasingly, our security relies on more than just having strong militaries. As our first line of defense, we also need strong, resilient societies and economies with robust infrastructure, with transport and telecommunications, including 5G and undersea cables. And we also need safer and more diverse supply lines for fuel, food, and medical supplies. And the medical has shown how quickly and how deeply our societies can be affected by a sudden shock. This time, it was due to a natural event, but next time it could be different. It could be man-made and deliberate. Imagine the impact of an attack that shuts down the internet or wipes clean our financial systems. This is why together, as allies, we must be able to identify our vulnerabilities, to mitigate any risks, and hold each other together accountable for increasing our resilience. For example, by screening foreign investment, ownership, and control of our critical infrastructure and assets. Because these are not just economic decisions, they are equally crucial for our security. And we should never trade our long-term security for short-term economic gain. As part of the NATO 2030 initiative, ensuring our ongoing resilience will be a central part of our summit decisions and a central part of the Secretary General's propositions for this very summit. As I was alluding before, developing resilience is increasingly a whole of society effort, not only whole of government, not only one agency or another, one ministry or another, one government or another, it's the whole of society. Because current threats aim to undermine the very foundation of our democratic societies. They try to dig deep at the core of our values. And the future of our society is at stake. we need to find our way throughout all current and eventual challenges with lucidity, with effectiveness, and always upholding values which fuel the progress of our societies, and also make sure that this is the ingredient in keeping our people safe and secure. If resilience is so important and is the buzzword in every corner we talk about resilience, there is also another structural element that is impacting on our societies, on our way of life, on our way of doing business, on our way of defining security, and this is technology. Of course, technological progress is a historical evolution, but the pace, the depth, the disruptive way in which technology is changing fundamentally every aspect of our lives has never been seen before. A trend that has been turbocharged by the pandemic. It is also changing the nature of conflict with cyber attacks, information warfare, and we see so much manipulation on a daily occurrence. As a result, the lines between civil and military, between conflict and non-conflict, are increasingly blurred. Throughout NATO's history, our nations have held a significant technological advance over our competitors, and that's another ingredient of our enduring success. But today, that advantage is being challenged by nations that do not share our democratic values, and we are not shy in saying that China and Russia are in that category. When it comes to developing new technologies, we still lead the world. And look, from Eastern Europe to Silicon Valley, from the newest NATO members to the founding members of NATO, in all our geographies, we have the best companies and the best universities and the best talent and the best intellect in operating and thriving in our free and open societies. But we need to go further and make sure that our armed forces adopt these technologies at scale and at pace, that our governments and our societies as a whole take advantage of these new technologies and are not themselves taken advantage of. When NATO leaders met in 2019, I remember it was my first leaders meeting in my new capacity as NATO's Deputy Secretary General. Our leaders agreed a comprehensive roadmap on emerging and disruptive technologies, including on things that are changing everything around us. Artificial intelligence, something that will be changing everything around us, quantum computing, and something that is already a huge transformation in civilian and military life, autonomous systems. This will help speed implementation, protect our industries from potential adversaries, and more importantly than anything else probably, build public trust by developing common ethical standards. And I'll stop here in saying that cooperation between NATO and the EU, for that matter, the two organizations that are two sides of the same coin, is vital in making sure that the power of regulation that the European Union has and the power of standardization that NATO has will work together in making sure that our values, the ethical principles that many young citizens of our societies are asking us, will be embedded in everything we do and will ensure that our values remain at the heart of our technological future. This means not only cooperation amongst institutions, but amongst allies themselves as nations, also NATO's partners. NATO has today 42 nations as partners all over the world. And I mentioned, of course, European Union, United Nations, the OECD, and many other organizations that are so relevant in this conversation. It also means greater collaboration between our governments and the other sides of the triad of the good society, which is public sector, private sector, and academia and NGOs. That's also part of our strength that our competitors do not have. A vibrant private sector, a vibrant academic sector, a vibrant and free civil society. This is where governments and the other entities in our open societies have to cooperate more than ever. Because once governments drove innovation. We remember the days when the internet was the innovation coming from the Pentagon, and many other things that came outer space. They're coming from governments. Today, things have changed. More than 90% of the innovations and new technologies that are also used in defense and security are produced by the private sector, both by the big tech companies, but also by the startups and venture capital firms. This is done by the private sector. We have to play together in this important effort in maintaining our security. It's not just security from a purely military way, it's also security from a much broader perspective. This is how we will maintain our technological edge, and not only that, but shape the future rules and norms at multi-level system of norms around technology in line with our values. This is an important issue that I know that for the young generation is also important because values matter as much as economic and technological progress. In a way of concluding, because I also want to be able to engage with you and to eventually answer some of your questions if you have any. For more than 7 decades, by the way, in 2024, NATO will be celebrating 75 years since the inception in 1949. NATO has embodied the deep bond between Europe and North America for all this period of time, in difficult times, in complex times, in more sunny times. And of course, 30 nations, 30 democracies, we do not always agree on everything, but that's naturally in a democracy. And I want to say also something, when you hear also in the media or in public conversations or social media, that there are sometimes plurality of views inside and among NATO. This is not a sign of weakness, my dear friends. It's a sign of strength. Because this is always the ingredient that when, despite different opinions, different interests, different geographies, when NATO allies agree on something, on whatever subject we agree upon together, this is something which is binding us together so powerfully, is showing the enduring strength of our values and our fundamental commitment to defend each other if, God forbid, an attack would occur. To stand side by side, one for all and all for one. This is important today, probably more than ever, because we work together to tackle the challenges of today and of tomorrow, and we always look into the future. And to be honest, even if I still relatively young, looking at the future, I think your generation has even a greater stake in what's going to happen than my generation and myself do now. Because as I said at the beginning, one day, and that day will be soon, the responsibility of leadership will fall on you and your generation. It will be up to you to look into the future, as we are trying to do now, to set the agenda, to anticipate change, and always to maintain the security of the 1 billion people who live in NATO countries. And I have every confidence that our future is safe in your hands. So thank you so much, Jeffrey. Thank you, dear friends, for inviting me, inviting so many colleagues from around NATO headquarters over the last few days. And I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very much for that speech. It was fantastic. First, my first question. You've discussed Russia and China. And of course, Russia and China are investing in new technologies. We could see the hypersonic missile, which is a big threat coming on, just to gain a competitive advantage. Would this have an impact on the role of deterrence in a traditional way? And do we actually need to rethink the concept of deterrence?
I mentioned, thank you, Jeffrey.
That's a very relevant question. I mentioned that permanent adaptation in what we do, our bread and butter, which is deterrence and defense, is in the DNA code of our alliance. As we speak, with the blessing of our political leaders, our military leaders are working on the most important transformation of the very essence of deterrence and defense of the transatlantic space in decades, in generations. And when we say in our jargon, we are looking at security from a 360 perspective from all over, we are not speaking only of 360 geographically. We're also speaking of 360 transversally across domains. A few years ago only, 5 years ago, we had the traditional 3 military domains, land, air, and of course the sea. 5 years ago, at the Warsaw Summit, I remember, I was not a NATO at that time, I was still active in politics. I remember that our leaders decided, and our military leaders started to operate on cyber as the 4th operation domain in NATO. And in London, when our leaders met, that time I was in NATO, our leaders decided and instructed us, and we are working very, very actively on space as the 5th operation domain. So I wanted to really send this very strong message that NATO is up to our game. Our political and our military leaders are doing everything it takes for us to protect the 1 billion people living in our countries. Of course, permanent adaptation. We are concerned about some of the evolutions we see in our competitors, but stay assured that our alliance is always and will always be ready to respond to any potential threat.
My next question is what you've said about permanent adaptation. But however, we've seen that COVID-19 and the pandemic is testing the limits of governments. It has forced governments to make difficult decisions, choices. Importantly, the pandemic has placed a significant burden on national budgets, including defense. Will countries commit to the 2% and 20% of defense budgets to major investments? And how can we keep encouraging countries to honor that commitment in this current, time of pandemics and crisis? Would COVID hamper potentially permanent adaptation? Or do we need to have a different mindset here?
It is, of course, a relevant question, because in difficult circumstances, political leaders have to respond to the questions and pressures coming from the public opinion, from the private sector, from societies. But let me give you 3 sub-answers to your very relevant question. First, look at the admirable way in which military personnel, men and women across the alliance, have come to the forefront of our common fight against the pandemic. In the last year or so, half a million of NATO military personnel have helped national governments in fighting this pandemic, and together with medical professionals, military personnel were there. So it's also proof that the military is useful also in civil military shocks like the pandemic. Secondly, as I mentioned in my speech, the fact that the pandemic has exacerbated so many of the fragilities and the problems and the competition globally, this only amplified, did not diminish, the combination of traditional risks with the new security threats that we are now witnessing. So if you want the canvas that governments, including through the budgets they appropriate, in defending a much broader definition of security, would mean that we need to continue to invest in our security and defense. And the third part, that in order for our defense establishments, including in NATO, but also at the national level, to be able to cope with this new definition, revised definition of security, we also have to make sure that the way in which we conduct the business of transforming our militaries, in introducing new technologies, in making sure that the money is wisely and professionally spent, every cent, every penny, every centime of the resources from our taxpayers have and are spending wisely and in making sure that we do this. And let me give you a simple answer. Without peace and security, nothing else in our lives can exist. That's the foundation of everything we do. That's the business of NATO, ensuring this foundation on which our lives, our private initiatives, our dreams, our frustrations can be expressed in freedom and in security. So I do believe that nations understand this. We have not seen any sign of backpedaling from the track of continuing to invest more, but also invest better and also invest in a logic that also helps the broad set of economic and security challenges that our nations face.
As we have some time limitations, of course, I'm going to do the last two questions. The first question is mostly about competing interests, and then the last question will be just about young professionals. So for the first question, the alliance is highly diverse, of course, and countries have competing interests. We've seen examples in Libya and Turkey highlighting France's withdrawal from Operation Sea Guardian. How do you ensure that NATO promotes solidarity in regards to these competing interests and different views? Especially it shows the role of NATO as a platform for transatlantic consultations. Do we need to build an alternative tools to facilitate the convergence of views among allies?
As I mentioned, we are an alliance of democracies, and we had difficult moments in our long already history. I remember I was not even born, but I'm reading in the history books the Suez Canal crisis, and then we had the American missiles in Western Europe situation in the 80s, and then. There's always a possibility that allies differ on the way in which they interpret a situation and their national security interest and the alliance. But the beauty of NATO is that we are the only political platform where such differences, when they occur, can be debated as between allies and people that share the same common interest to defend each other. Nobody can afford to weaken the alliance, and that's why we are the platform of choice for discussing also things that are not there. We had a difficult moment a few months ago between two allies, Greece and Turkey. NATO offered, Secretary General offered to both leaderships of these two very important allies the NATO platform for military deconfliction mechanism in order to make sure that we avoid incidents in the Aegean Sea. So this is how democracies do work. Sometimes things differ, but again, when it comes to the fundamental purpose of NATO, we always find in the end, through the negotiation and compromise and protecting this sacrosanct commitment to defend each other, a way to move forward and overcome eventual difficulties when they occur.
So to my last question, and this is to wrap things all up. We've seen the importance of youth. We've seen the importance of youth in NATO 2030. Given your extensive professional experience, what advice would you give young people trying to shape security and defense in the next 5 years, or just building up their career?
This is something which is so close to my heart. I've been doing and trying to invest in leadership in young generations for most of my adult political and professional careers. I founded the Aspen Institute in Romania because Aspen is about leadership. So probably I'm a little bit biased here, but I would say I have no doubt that young, gifted, ambitious, and sophisticated young leaders will find a way to excel in the line of work they are preparing for. But there is one thing when it comes to leadership is the value-based leadership. And I'm encouraging all the young friends that I encounter, and I'm also happy to speak to you, Jeffrey, and to the forum, is that when it will be a moment for you to have a doubt, for you to be called to lead, to make difficult decisions, to adjust, to be able to be resilient, in the end will come to the values that you embody. So as you invest in yourselves, in your professional skills, in your multifaceted education, never forget that at the core of who we are as human beings are our values. And try to define those values. No, you should not be a uniform thing. Each of us have sensitivities. Each of us are more inclined for community work, for political leadership, for community service. Being a leader doesn't mean that you become the president of the United States of America or president of Romania. Being a leader means you make a difference in your life, in your family's life, but also in your community's life. So my strong appeal, always try to define who you are, in what you believe, and let that be your North Star. And this will be leading you in the right direction, no matter the challenges that would appear, because life is always full of opportunities, but also of challenges. So that will be my passionate encouragement to our young audience and to young leaders all over the world.
We have to end it here, as we no longer have any time. On behalf of the Atlantic Forum, I would like to thank you for your time, and I hope to see you back here again. Thank you.
I will be back.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first panel of the Atlantic Forum Spring Conference by the title An Alliance Bound to Lead, Converging Towards 2030. In this panel, we will discuss the continued relevance of the Atlantic Alliance today, the multiplicity of challenges it is facing, and the transformation it is undergoing in order to meet the demands of an ever-changing security environment. A few days ago, on April 4th, NATO turned 72, an age where most of us would think about retiring. NATO, instead, is still in full activity and swarming with new ideas, projects, exercises. So the question is, why does NATO still matter? How did an alliance that was originally born to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down manage to still be relevant in a world that is radically different, where, for example, Germany is a trusted ally? The first answer that can be given to this fundamental question is that NATO was born to guarantee all citizens within its territory one core service: security. In Maslow's hierarchy of needs, safety and security come in terms of urgency right after physiological needs, such as drinking, eating, and sleeping. Being safe and secure is what makes everything else in your life possible. Feeling that your life and the lives of your loved ones are safe and threatened allows you to dream, to make plans for the future, to start a business or a family, to take that interesting class at university, trusting that you will be there to see your projects succeed. In this sense, as citizens of the Euro-Atlantic area, we are used to peace and safety as normal. In truth, we are so used to being safe that we are deeply troubled by any instance of uncertainty and insecurity. However, it was not always like this. There was a time when a war was fought on so for 7 years, and the Atlantic Alliance itself was created after World Wars devastated Europe. 72 years of peace and security in the area are, in fact, an unprecedented accomplishment. Virtually all allies will survive longer than the scientific contingency that led to the creation. So, what makes NATO an exception? If I had to identify one single factor, it is the fact that when confronted with systemic shifts, NATO has not relied on past stories. On the contrary, it has gone so far by learning to adapt. And in turn, this was made possible by the fact that NATO wasn't born only to confront a common threat, but also to reflect the common history, vision, and values of European and North American democracies, and their intention to solve problems together. And so, at the end of the Cold War, NATO ceased to be a full-time nuclear defense, but it did not retire. It became something else. It became capable of planning, executing, and learning from out-of-area operations. It learned to confront new challenges: terrorism, insurgencies, and political instability. It discovered its own potential as a political diplomatic forum for discussing all matters concerning security, and has significantly contributed to a number of agendas, from regional stability to nuclear disarmament. And now, times are changing again. As much as analysts love the post-Cold War period, alas, it currently coming to an end. Today, we are once again worried about great power rivalry, but we also have new worries, such as climate change and disruptive technologies. It is in this context that the NATO 2030 initiative was launched. And thus, it is once again the time to have a serious discussion about who we are, what we stand for, and how we want to embed it and communicate it forward. We need a NATO that is fast, young, versatile. We needed to look at cyber and space, at disinformation and political instability, beyond the sheer logic of power. And we needed to do so, even though the 30 NATO members do not always share the same perception or assessment. Arguably, the way to proceed is finding political unity among allies. But what does finding political unity mean? It is certainly not just the occasion for another summit or a photo op. Finding political unity means deciding who we want to be in 2030 and agreeing on a plan together. It means rediscovering what bound the original 12 NATO members and what binds the 30 allies today, which is perfectly represented by the preamble language of the Washington Treaty. In Washington, NATO members resolved to unite their efforts not only for their collective defense, but also for the preservation of peace and security. What would this political unity look like? First, and perhaps most importantly, NATO and the North Atlantic Council as the principal political forum for discussing all regional and global political and security matters affecting North America and Europe. Secondly, it means rebalancing the transatlantic partnership. A recent NATO Defense College policy brief suggested, for example, that the US will need to avoid excessively pushing allies to take actions that are not coherent with their core values and threat perceptions. If anything, the US would need to be willing to conduct painstaking diplomacy to bring allies along on key geopolitical issues while accepting that it would be unable to do so policy preferences. Third, the worrisome pattern of democratic deterioration within the alliance should be promptly addressed. Otherwise, finding the political will through NATO's political centrality may be extremely difficult. Furthermore, the COVID-19 pandemic did not make the issue any easier to address. From the economic point of view, in fact, the recovery of NATO members is likely to be uneven. However, these centrifugal forces should not discourage NATO from pursuing the role as of the essential transatlantic political forum. On the contrary, this difficult situation underscores the urgency of the task that needs to be confronted in order to avert the risk that political independence may be threatened from within. Finally, it is important that NATO becomes increasingly capable to communicate its standing, values, and projects to a number of different stakeholders. In fact, in an increasingly complex world where security challenges are more diverse and diffuse, it is especially important to engage with a broad set of stakeholders, to take different perspectives into consideration, and eventually to make NATO's goals and means understandable and fully transparent, because hearts and minds must be one at home. In this sense, NATO needs to reflect on its role when it comes to transatlantic training and education, crucial to fostering cooperation and boosting interoperability. It needs to call upon the expert, think tank, and academic community to provide their expertise and analysis in order to individuate emerging threats and challenges, as well as opportunities and good practices. Seminars like this one are also important because they allow young professionals like myself to ask questions to the people that are most qualified to answer, because they allow to start discussion that can be taken back to universities, think tanks, and headquarters, and who knows, maybe translating into new projects. And finally, because they empower the new generation of leaders to be heard and to acquire a stake in their own future. Now, to translate these words into reality, I would like to introduce you my first speaker, Dr. Benedetta Berti. Since 2018, Dr. Berti serves as the head of policy planning in the Office of the Secretary General at NATO. An Eisenhower Global Fellow and TED Senior Fellow, she has held positions at West Point, the Institute for National Security Studies, and the Tel Aviv University, among others. Actually, many others. I had trouble selecting the most relevant. Her areas of expertise include human security, internal conflict, integration of armed groups, post-conflict stabilization, and crisis management and prevention. Dr. Berti, as you are heavily engaged in the NATO 2030 process, can you tell us more about its aim? What is the vision that is being pursued, and how should we imagine the NATO of year 2030?
Absolutely. And thank you, Shari, for that very kind introduction, and also for laying the ground and for making it easier for us to come in and talk about the future, because, of course, you started the presentation by reminding us all of NATO's 7 decades of rich history. And I think you very rightly pointed out 2 elements that are absolutely key to NATO's continued strength and success. One, of course, is that providing this unique platform for transatlantic coordination, consultation, and joint action around issues of common security and defense. And I very much agree with you that this is incredibly important. I would say NATO is not just the primary platform, it is essentially the only. It is a unique platform. It serves a unique role because it is truly the only platform we have where North America and Europe sit at the same table on a daily basis to discuss their common security and defense. And that's very much part and parcel we need to preserve and strengthen towards 2030. Of course, NATO's success is also grounded in the fact that the main principle of the alliance is incredibly simple, yet incredibly powerful: one for all and one for one. And that's really the cohesion and strength upon which our entire alliance is predicated. And then, and I think you summarized this very eloquently, the ability of NATO to adapt and to respond to the changing security environment is what has ensured that the alliance has remained relevant throughout the past 7 decades. So with this just pre-show remarks, I would say we are well set to look at the decade ahead and to look at 2030. NATO 2030 is really exactly about what you may think it is here in the title. Is about how do we make our strong alliance even stronger? How do we adapt to the next decade? And how do we make sure that confronting the manifold, different and diffuse challenges of the future, we're able to remain a strong military alliance, to broaden our approach to security, to become even stronger politically, and to take a more global approach while remaining a regional organization. Because, of course, NATO's first and foremost unchanging mission is exactly that, to provide for the security and defense of the almost 1 billion citizens that live in our 30 allied nations. So to make a very long story short, because I want to leave also as much time as possible for the Q&A, but over a year ago, at the last leaders meeting, the last time the heads of state and government of our 30 allies met in London, they asked the Secretary General to lead a process, a forward-looking process, to provide concrete recommendations on how we meet the challenges of the future. This is the genesis of NATO 2030, and its conclusion will come at the upcoming 2021 NATO summit, where allied leaders will agree a set of practical decisions on how we continue to adapt our alliance. We all think that the next summit will be an incredibly important one. It will be an opportunity to open a new chapter in the transatlantic relations. It will be an opportunity to recommit, reaffirm, and build and continue to build our alliance even stronger. So with that, really, I would say predominantly positive and bold level of ambition. Now we are working inside the alliance to come to the agreement in terms of what are we doing concretely to continue to adapt. And of course, we are in the middle of the process, so I cannot give you the full results yet, but I can tell you a little bit about where we're heading and what are our priorities. And here I would start by saying that, of course, our bread and butter and our core function and what we need to continue to do in order to remain relevant in 2030 is to remain a strong military alliance, because that's military strength is what underlines everything we do as a political military alliance. And here, of course, it is there's several important issues under this framework. One is, of course, the importance of continuing to commit to invest in our defense. And here, of course, we have a positive story, because since 2014, all allies have increased their defense spending and are continue to show that we are in an upward trajectory when it comes to showing that we are recommitting and strengthening our efforts to when it comes to deterrence and defense. At the same time, looking to 2030, I think one of our priorities is to make sure we do even more together, so that we fund together more of our exercise, of our activities, that we do more of our deterrence and defense activities together. But of course, and this is something that the Deputy Secretary General already hinted to, being strong militarily in 2030 also means being able to deal with a much broader range of threats that are more asymmetric and more diffuse. So that's why one of our key areas of investment in NATO 2030 is resilience. And I'm not going to repeat what the Deputy Secretary General so eloquently explained, but I'll just mention that this is a second really important area of work where we want to step up the work we are already doing. We already have baseline requirements on resilience that we use to advise and work with allies, so that we have a minimum level of shared resilience, but we should do and continue to do more in this realm, recognizing that our potential adversary are really using all the tools in their toolbox in an integrated manner, from military to political to social to economic tools. So our approach to resilience must be equally broad and integrated. Innovation and technology is another area where NATO 2030 has very ambitious goals, and the Deputy Secretary General mentioned the fact that we are concretely advancing through a joint strategy among our 30 allies on how to strengthen our investment in emerging and disruptive technologies. But with NATO 2030, we really want to focus on how we encourage more transatlantic cooperation, more cooperation across the Atlantic when it comes to our investment in emerging and disruptive technologies, because we recognize that historically, our ability to deter and defend has been closely linked to our ability to maintain a technological superiority. So we will continue to invest very heavily in defense innovation and specifically in emerging and disruptive technologies. So these are more of the, if you wish, more expected areas of focus of NATO 2030 because they focus on NATO's military aspects. But of course, with NATO 2030, we're also really looking out to make NATO even stronger politically. And that means that we recognize, and exactly as you said at the beginning, Shari, we recognize that this is the only platform that the transatlantic community has to coordinate, consult, and act together when it comes to security and defense. So we need to really use it to its full potential. And of course, this is especially important as if I look at the next decade, I think one of the key dynamics that we cannot ignore is that of growing geopolitical competition and growing pressure being placed on the international rules-based order, and I believe in a world of growing competition and advancing authoritarianism, it would be even more important for us to use NATO politically to agree common approaches and common ways to deal with the systemic challenges we face. So that's another really important area of NATO 2030. And finally, I'm really summarizing here because there's a lot of I would say substance on all of these priorities, but for the sake of time, I'm just giving you the gist. And a very important third area of work that is very much complementary to the work we're doing to strengthen NATO politically is for the alliance to really be able to take a broader, a more global approach. And again, more global approach doesn't mean changing the nature of NATO as a regional organization, but it does mean recognizing that the security challenges we face are global, and they require a global approach and an integrated toolkit that really uses military and non-military tools. So what do I mean with a more global approach? I mean first that we are taking concrete steps to increase the work we do when it comes to protecting the rules-based international order, including by working more with like-minded partners. For example, NATO has increased in recent years its work with its Asia-Pacific partners, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and Korea. And of course, that's I think a very good example to think about how a regional alliance can tackle global challenges by working with like-minded partners. Of course, when talking about tackling global challenges, I didn't mention that we are, of course, also invested in NATO's ability to play its part when it comes to the impact of climate change on security. The alliance just recently agreed a practical agenda on climate change and security, and as is very much in the midst of implementing many measures that are aimed to make sure that we're able to fully understand, fully prepare for, fully adapt for the security impact of climate change, and also looking at how we can mitigate and contribute to combating climate change by being more energy efficient, more investing in green technologies. And of course, all of this is also good for our operational effectiveness. And these are just some of the areas, of course. There is much more work behind NATO 2030, but I think it gives you a little bit of the breadth and depth of the debate that are being held right now at NATO, and it also gives you a sense of direction. And the sense of direction is to prepare NATO, to prepare our alliance for a world of increasing geopolitical competition, a world in which we need to be able to stand even closer together as allies and as democracies, and a world in which we need to be able at the same time, so simultaneously, to tackle existing threats, to deter and defend in the conventional realm, but at the same time to really deal with a broader set of security challenges. So that's the work That's NATO 2030 in a nutshell, and I think it gives us a very strong blueprint to look at how we are continuing to adapt as an alliance in the next decade and beyond. And I'll stop here.
Thank you, Dr. Berti, for a well-rounded response depicting a well-rounded process that touches on every aspect of NATO, the political, economic, military domains, but also to renovate for the next decade. I would like to introduce my second speaker, Professor Sven Biskup, who is the director of the Europe in the World program at Egmont Royal Institute for International Relations in Brussels, which he joined in 2002. And he is also a professor at Ghent University. His research and teaching focus on the strategies of the European Union, NATO, and their member states. And because of this, my question for you is two-faceted. The broad question is, what are the main challenges that NATO faces in ensuring political cohesion and unity throughout the alliance? The first aspect is how the transatlantic partnership, especially taking into account that as it cyclically happens, the two shores of the Atlantic have been very far away in the past few years. And the second aspect of the question is taking into account the degradation of democratic standards within certain NATO members, something that I mentioned in my introductory speech. Is it time for the North Atlantic Council to become a forum for discussion related to those NATO members who fail to, quoting the Washington Treaty, safeguard the freedom, common heritage, and civilization of their peoples, founded on the principles of democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me on this conference. I think there are two, and I combined my answer to the two questions into one, because I think the second question about democratic backsliding in some allies is very much linked to the future of political cohesion. I have the feeling, on the one hand, there are issues such as precisely democratic backsliding that NATO ought to be paying more attention to, but isn't, if it wants to maintain its cohesion. On the other hand, I have the feeling that NATO is importing issues onto its agenda that are divisive, that are perhaps not really NATO topics or not primarily. So to turn to both in turn. One, democratic backsliding is indeed a major issue, and I think it's very damaging for the political cohesion of the alliance. The alliance did not start as an alliance of democracies. When NATO was created, and later on, actually some authoritarian states were invited into the alliance for strategic reasons. But that has evolved, of course. So NATO, I think now today is not just about the defense of the territory and the sovereignty of the allies. It's also the defense of the democratic system of each of the allies. But what does that mean then if one allied country, begins to undo its democracy? I think the other democratic allies, would be hard put to convince their public opinion to put their armed forces at risk to defend an authoritarian like regime in another NATO ally, because that's not the point of NATO. So I think those leaders and actors who are going back on democracy should perhaps realize that they are also somehow undermining the cohesion of the alliance and thus putting their security at risk. Now, I would posit that for those NATO allies that are also EU member states, that the main responsibility to maintain democratic standards lies with the Union. And the Union also has the most tools there. The Union too woke up rather too late to this problem, is now taking measures, but it's going slowly and very painfully, and I think ought to be much more severe vis-à-vis undemocratic acts by governments in Hungary and Poland, for example. But I do also think, as you suggested, Sherry, that it should be an item for the North Atlantic Council, including, of course, for those NATO allies such as Turkey that are not EU member states, and that we ought to be much more explicit about this. I mean, I understand, of course, that if you're in the NAC, or if you're working for NATO, that your concern is to make sure that NATO operates and that you can't import each and every problem between allies onto the NATO agenda. But I think this concerns the very functioning of the alliance, and I think NATO must much more explicitly deal with democratic backsliding among its members. Now, secondly, the other side of this, there is a cyclical tendency also, that is every so many years, somehow there is the idea that NATO is losing relevance. Somehow people begin to fear that, which is basically meaningless because, you know, as was very well explained, the relevance of NATO is obvious. It's Article 5 and it's the collective defense guarantee. So there is no doubt about its relevance. But somehow, every so many years, some people begin to fear for relevance, and the answer is always the same. Let's broaden the scope of NATO. Let's put more topics on the agenda. And then NATO begins to discuss climate change, migration, energy, technology, geoeconomics, and now also China. Now, of course, the allies must discuss everything among themselves in NATO that they think is of relevance to their security and defense. But that doesn't mean that in each of these areas it is then to the NATO apparatus to develop a policy and to begin to write papers about it. So I think sometimes we conflate the alliance, which is the bond between the allies, with the apparatus, the NATO bureaucracy, to use that term in a non-pejorative way. On many of these issues, actually, NATO, has no instruments, and so does not have the capacity to shape policy. So I think we must somehow develop the habit that we may discuss some issues in the NAC because we think they have relevance for security and defense, but then decide that the best way to take action on them is probably by the individual allies, or in many cases on the European side by the European Union, rather than by the NATO apparatus. And I'll take two examples. One is China. China is obviously a major strategic issue, the rise of China. But the way that we position ourselves vis-à-vis China today, that's very much an issue of foreign policy and of geoeconomics. And so, in my view, it is logical that on the European side of the Atlantic, the European Union takes the lead in developing what is a foreign policy towards China, and that the NATO apparatus deal with China to the extent that it monitors the development of Chinese military capabilities, to the extent that it monitors the implications for NATO defense, but it basically plays a complementary role to the leading role, which must be played by, on the one hand, of course, Washington, and on the other hand, Brussels, but EU Brussels. And this was in a way became evident when 2 weeks ago the NATO foreign ministers met, talked a lot about China, did not actually mention it in the declaration, but instead Secretary of State Blinken met afterwards with the EU High Representative Borrell, where they finally started the EU-US dialogue on China. That was already announced under the Trump administration, but proved impossible. I think that's exactly it. So my humble advice to the US would be, don't try to channel everything through NATO. If it's not primarily a defense issue, speak directly with the EU if you want to get things done. And the same applies to resilience. I can see the point of setting sort of standards in NATO when it comes to resilience. There are these 7 areas that NATO has identified where resilience is key. But at the same time, it is up to individual allies, or in the case of the EU member states, up to the European Union to decide on how to achieve resilience. Resilience is very much about geoeconomics. That's the main aspect of it. It's about it's about finding a balance between an open market but protecting sensitive sectors. To put it very concretely, it is not up to NATO or it is not up to the US to decide which company from which country can invest on the single market of the European Union. That's an EU-only decision. So again, in resilience, I think NATO has the complementary role to play. The supporting role, the leading role, is to be played by the European Union. So if I conclude, I would say that NATO's relevance and cohesion is a matter of its focus on its core task, at which it is very well, and that is collective defense. So I think maybe it is time that we come somehow to a more precise division of labor. For a long time, I thought the division of labor between NATO and the EU was not a good idea, because the world is complex, and the moment you devise a division of labor, then something will happen that doesn't fit into it. But the result of not having a clear division of labor is perennial mutual suspicion. So I would say, let's divide the roles. Let's make it clear that the aspiration to European strategic autonomy does not now extend to collective territorial defense. That will be done within NATO, and that should set everybody's mind at ease who fears that European strategic autonomy might undermine the alliance. It will not. But within the alliance, I think the European allies should step up their effort and contribute a much larger share of the NDPP targets. When it comes to resilience, however, if you want the non-military part of Article 5, there for me it's obvious that the EU should take the lead and that NATO should play the supporting role. Secondly, when it comes then to non-Article 5 operations, crisis management outside NATO and EU territory, there I would say put the EU in the lead, because this is basically the EU's southern flanks. NATO is, genetically watching to the east, is watching Russia. And I think for NATO, the South will always be a sideshow in spite of regular symbolic utterances about it. So put the EU in charge of crisis management on the southern flank, which is not so much a defense issue as deterrence of Russia. It's a much more integrated approach. And finally, integrate defense planning and capability development. NATO and the EU are now both trying to guide their members' defense planning and capability development. That obviously doesn't work so well. So I would say the EU does need a level of ambition to decide for its task of crisis management on the southern flank, which capabilities does it require, but integrate as such into the NATO defense planning process and set some collective targets within the NDPP for the EU. These are, of course, all things that are easy to say for me as an academic, but it's our job, I think, to ask the difficult questions and to put proposals on the table that might not be politically feasible today, but that might be feasible one day. So thanks again for giving me the opportunity to take part.
Thank you. And I do agree that there is this preoccupying tendency that every few years we see a re-emergence of the NATO in crisis literature. But as per your conclusion, that this usually leads to broadening NATO scope, this actually resonates really well with the question I had in mind for Dr. Kovalchikova, so I actually can introduce her to our audience. She obtained her PhD in international relations with a focus on security threats, and she currently is a program manager and fellow at the Alliance for Securing Democracy at the German Marshall Fund's Brussels office. So the question I wanted to ask you is, how does NATO review its strategic concept and chart a common course for the alliance? And should NATO update its strategic concept to include a larger variety of threats more specifically in order to meet the objectives of the 2030 benchmark? And a third aspect of this question is where there seems to be further potential for NATO to get involved. How to address, in other words, the emerging challenges that we are witnessing in these years. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sherry, and it's a pleasure to be part of this conversation today. I'll try to address all three questions. Talking about the strategic concept and do we need it? Is it necessary to update? I think it's very important that NATO is having this 2030 reflection process, but any other reflection process, especially as it's been a decade since the strategic concept has been adopted in 2010. Is very important, and it's necessary to consider that there have been changes in our security challenges, and they have also evolved in the ways that impacts the institutional capacities and needs to address them. So I think it's quite a timely and also necessary to reflect on those changes and the evolution of the threats and the breadth and also the depth of the threats that have been currently present and will be also in the future, and think in a strategic way, not only 10 years, but also further this, especially in the sector of technology and innovation, we are talking very, very much about something that is already maybe tomorrow all that is today. So we have to think very much strategically about the technological advancement. So yes, the short answer would be we do need to consider wider spectrum of the threats. I take the point of Professor Biscop about the fact of the focus and making sure that we are effective in addressing them. But I don't think it's exclusive in some way. I do agree that we do have to have understanding of the division of labor to a certain extent, but also there is a lot of complementary effort, and there are also a lot of, I think, overlapping challenges. So sometimes I do think that we need to also consider more, I would say, flexibly of which challenges we can address through which platforms and tools, and think together when to use them and where are the most appropriate, but not shy away from developing those tools and having them ready whenever the occasion arises. Second, perhaps, I think this effort, this process is part of deterrence technique as well, showing that I think NATO is not only thinking, but is willing to address wider spectrum of changes if it touches upon the security of the member states, is also a deterrence mechanism to show that NATO is capable and wants to be even more capable to deter any aggression. And this is not only, I would say, in the typical military space, but we have seen during the pandemic that also certain actors have increased their activity and assertiveness in the information space, for example. And these are many times connected efforts used in combination with other tools that may ultimately lead to either undermining our democracy, democratic institutions and processes, but also security. And I think it's important to take those activities, this assertiveness, as, for example, we have seen also by China during the pandemic, seriously, and address also the threats that may be connected to the dependency, either being technological dependency, energy dependency, or economic dependency. And we cannot just I think it's important to understand and realize that these economic tools are also having many times spillover effect to political area or the security area. More concretely, I think it's quite important that NATO has been recognizing also the challenges in the tech space and the need to innovate not only in technology in the civilian space but also in the military space, as many times this civilian military domain is much more intertwined with the technological development. And I think this is one of the areas where there is a lot of potential for NATO to further build the capabilities, but also innovate and be more resilient. And perhaps on the resilience, because it's been mentioned also by the Deputy Secretary General in his opening remarks, by my previous speakers here, colleagues on the panel. But I do think that resilience is also quite a wider category that we need to think also more holistically about it. It's also about societal resilience. It's also about building trust in our democratic systems, in our authoritative institutions, in our governments, which at the same time, I think does need to come with the accountability of those governments. So NATO has an opportunity to lead by example, showing, and I do agree that it's important to also recognize certain vulnerabilities and work on them and improve existing vulnerabilities in our systems internally, domestically, in order to be stronger, but also create this credibility and the trust in the longer term. So the citizens can fully trust in and recognize, appreciate the democratic legitimacy and the legitimacy of these organizations that have been there for, in the NATO case, over 7 decades, but also of the EU and other institutions together, to be able to defend them and to bring stability and keep and remain the stability, but also ensure that they are able to cooperate, and they do cooperate, and they improve, and as Benedetta nicely put it, they also kind of introduce these blueprints and set certain standards that can be followed by either the governments, also the partner countries, but we can also learn a lot from the partner countries. So I do not want to elaborate much further, because I would really enjoy also having some Q&A part on it. But just to end on a little bit positive note with the potential, I do think that actually in the connecting of the alliances and democratic alliances, especially, and partners, there is a lot of strength. And therefore, I think there is a lot of potential for NATO to really enhance its role, especially with the ambition of having more of a global outreach or outlook, as it's been defined also in the Secretary General's annual report, by really strengthening these relationships with the partners, be it other countries in the Indo-Pacific or Western Balkans or other regions that have been very much close partners already for a while, but also are experiencing challenges that NATO can help address, but also the other organizations such as EU, African Union, other organizations NATO have been already working with. I think there is a lot of potential to actually deepen and strengthen those relationships going forward as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kovalchikova. And we actually have time for a final round of questions. The first one goes to Dr. Berti. And saying that NATO's nature is that of a regional defense alliance is certainly legitimate. So the question still regards the broadening scope of NATO, touching on a number of different issues, from establishing global partnerships to tackling climate change. And I want to ask you, do you think that we are still essentially tackling security? Is just that the concept of security changed? Like today, there's a lot of talking about human security, and I think that explained in common words is what I was mentioning before about being not only physically safe, but also feeling psychologically safe and being able to plan for the future, to hope and to know that everything will be eventually all right, that there is no threat coming at you. Thank you.
The short answer is yes, but then let me elaborate it a little bit. And I think that it is absolutely true that we are looking, NATO's job is very clear, NATO's mission is very clear. It's the security and defense of our allies. But what does it take to guarantee that security and defense, of course, changes as the security environment changes. And in a world in which, of course, the lines between civil and military, peace and war is much more blurred, it is obvious that the only way to secure our territory and protect our population is to broaden our approach to security. So on that, I completely agree. I also want to say, historically, we have never been just about territorial security. If even in our 1949 founding treaty, and in its even our founding forefathers, in a way, had already talked about NATO being about the protection and the defense of the territory, the people, the values, and the way of life. And that's the way of life is the expression that is already there. So in a way, I would say this very much is not about reinventing the wheel, and I agree that we shouldn't. It is about sticking to our initial mandate. But I do believe that it's very important to do keep the focus. At the same time, I recognize that there are issues where ignoring the security implication would simply not be feasible for us. For example, climate change has very real security implications, but climate change also has very real implication on our army's function, on what type of equipment we need, or what type of planning we need, or what type of climate resilience we need for our installations and facilities. And of course, we need to take care of it, because ultimately we need to be able to deploy and operate in a world in which the climate is changing and creating an environment, an operational environment that is wilder, wetter, windier, and more complex. So, of course, we cannot be the first responder when it comes to climate change, but at the same time not adapting to the security implications will ensure we lose our relevance, and that we cannot afford. So I would say that's the balance, and it's an important one to strike. I think our compass needs to be always our mission, the defense and security of the transatlantic space. And of course, we have those three core tasks that kind of lay out very nicely what we need to do. And those are, of course, as reminded, defense and deterrence, but they're also crisis management, and they're also cooperative security, which really means working with our partners and really means working more on what you would call the softer side of security as well. So I think in doing that, we're actually very much in keeping with the essence of NATO. But I do recognize there is always there's a strong importance in maintaining a focus. And then I would just say that I really appreciated the comments about how we really need to continue to work closely with the European Union when it comes to these issues. I couldn't agree more. At the same time, of course, we also need to remember from the point of view of NATO, a very basic fact that 90% of NATO citizens live in a EU country. Sorry, 90% of EU citizens are also living in a NATO country, but only roughly 40% of our citizens live in a EU country. So let me repeat, roughly more than 60% of NATO citizens, the citizens we are sworn to protect, do not live in a NATO country. So of course we need to look at issues like resilience. Of course we need to look at issues where of course we need to protect our almost 1 billion population and of course when we think about the security and the defense of Europe, it's very difficult to have that conversation without thinking about the role of the United States and Canada in the West, the role of the United Kingdom, the role of Norway in the North, and the role of Turkey in the South. So of course we have to have that transatlantic perspective, but at the same time it's incredibly important that we work together as like-minded organizations.
Absolutely. Thank you. And my next question goes to Professor Biskup. As Dr. Berti just mentioned, there's a lot of geographical overlapping between NATO and the EU. But where's the area of overlapping for interest, and what's the best platform or the best forum for developing eventually a synergy between NATO and the EU?
Yeah. Thing to mention is, of course, citizen of the EU. One is not a citizen of NATO. I'm a Belgian citizen, therefore I'm also a citizen of the EU. And as a citizen of the EU, I have direct rights, and EU legislation directly applies in Belgium. So that is my daily life. I am not a citizen of NATO. Belgium is a member of NATO. And I think that is a key difference that is perhaps not always clear to people who do not live in an EU member state. Your country is not a member of the EU like you're a member of NATO or another organization. You really are the EU, and legislation is made that has a permanent impact on your daily life. So in that sense, there is somehow a qualitative difference. I think there are two dimensions that need to be addressed if you really want to end the perennial beauty contest between the bureaucracy of the two organizations. The first layer is the eternal dispute about Cyprus and Greece and Turkey, who basically abuse the fact that one is in NATO but not in the EU, and who abuse that fact to block EU-NATO cooperation forever. And Cyprus is the only EU member state that is neither an ally nor a partner of NATO, and that makes any truly thorough cooperation between EU security and defense policy and NATO impossible. Frankly, I think that if we wanted to, we could solve this. I know that Turkey forever blocks this, but if the leading nations within NATO would really want to solve it, I'm quite sure that they could lean sufficiently on Ankara to solve it. So I fear that some people, both sides of the Atlantic, also find it quite convenient that we cannot really solve EU-NATO cooperation, and they are hiding behind that. But even if the Turkey issue the Cyprus issue would go away tomorrow, we would still not be there, because in the end the question is who does what, and neither side of the Atlantic is very clear here. The United States continuously asks the Europeans do more, spend more on defense, but whenever then the Europeans do something that seems to perhaps threaten US leadership or US dominance, then the Americans immediately push back. So there's a permanent ambiguity there in the American position. But there's also a permanent ambiguity in the European position. In the EU context, many talk about strategic autonomy, but they don't want to be too autonomous. They want to be autonomous, but not so autonomous that the US would still not come and save them if they get in trouble. And so as long as both sides remain ambiguous about what it is that they really want, we will never have a really thorough and constructive cooperation between the two organizations. Again, I reiterate my point. In my view, the way to solve this is to clarify which organization plays the leading role and which plays a supporting role in different areas. And once that is accepted, and that is for member states to decide, not for the apparatus to decide, then one could eventually hope for an end to the beauty contest, which wastes a lot of time and energy. I mean, I make a living writing about it, but I could also make a living writing about successful cooperation. So I think that would be rather better. Thanks again.
Thank you. You actually put forward a really interesting perspective that is taking into account the specific positions of the member states, whether they belong to the European Union, NATO, or both. Now, we have talked at length about maintaining political unity, and if there is one thing that can actually bring down political stability, political unity, and unity of vision, that is disinformation. So I would like to ask Dr. Kovalchikova, how does NATO engage with diverse stakeholders to ensure that every citizen is protected against the threat? And as I know that COVID was a particularly difficult time, how has the information space been used by malign actors during the pandemic, and why it's important to address it?
Thank you for this question. NATO 2030 reflection process, but also the session that we have today, that's the whole Spring Conference Atlantic Forum is organizing, is part of the role and the importance of raising awareness across different audiences. A young generation is one of them. Geographical different audiences matter as well. Generational, of course, different groups, marginalized groups as well, that are being targeted by disinformation, or just need to also be able to have access to information to better orientate themselves within the topics like anyone else. I think this is part of the efforts that NATO has been already doing, and this process is an evidence of that. There have been many others, and I am confident there will be more in the future as well. And the engagement with the audiences more actively is I think, critical, especially when, for example, during the pandemic now, we have been very much all isolated within our spaces, and the physical interaction has been limited. On one hand, it creates the opportunity to really reach many more people through the different communication channels that they have been consuming during this pandemic, as a lot of people are spending much more time, I think, online than when we are in normal or so-called normal circumstances. On the other hand, there are also challenges of how to really build these trusted partnerships or audiences for them to really be able to relate to the people, to the authoritative voices that they are hearing and seeing on the screens, which during the kind of let's say more normal pre-pandemic times created this kind of bond that people perhaps were able to reach out and have more direct access to also certain leaders talking, or experts talking about certain issues. Now we are kind of dependent on the technology that, as I mentioned, provides opportunities, but also perhaps can lead to certain distance, and therefore it's very important to try to reach through different communication channels, through different tools, through different languages. I think it's extremely important to keep in mind that we have the beauty of various languages, but also the responsibility to really use them to address the audiences and the citizens in different, here in this case, member states, but also other countries, to share our messaging and to connect with them. And I think these are opportunities and challenges at the same time, depending on how they are used. And another, I think, important point here that I have seen already NATO doing and other organizations, but also can be done more by anyone, all of us, is to tailor the messages and communicate them not only through the channels people consume, but also the way they connect information and connect the dots and through the issues that they really matter to them. So sometimes I think issues may be very abstract to them, because security questions may be too big, but when it's connected to their daily lives, why does climate change matter to their daily life? Why is it really impacting the security of the citizens? Or why we need to build the societal resilience in order to make sure that, for example, during the election time, but beyond as well, people understand if there is certain information manipulation and are resilient to it, and or at least can detect it, identify it, and make an informed decision when being aware to and exposed to the challenges that such an information manipulation can bring. And perhaps to your last point, how was it used during the pandemic, and why does it matter to address it? Well, we have seen that various actors, be it domestic or foreign actors, have really used the opportunity of frame the messaging in the ways that was convenient. For example, in the case of the foreign actors, we are not very much surprised. We were not surprised to see that Russia has been very active in the information space, but China has become much more active in the information space. And the fact that there are a lot of messages about the virus, the origins, the spread, the treatments, all of this also became a little bit of a geopolitical discussion to shift the blame or to see who is responsible for what, and potentially even divide certain member states. We have seen that one of the top Kremlin's messages, state-led media, were basically attacking NATO or EU and how divided they are, or how they need to coordinate. Yes, they do need to coordinate more, but seeing one message exponentially more amplified also to a certain extent, of course, manipulates the perception of such a message and gives it other importance than if it would be in the real context and without the fake or let's say inauthentic amplification. So I think this is important to recognize that we are facing also new challenges because new tools are being used. There are also potentially new opportunities that we can also address and use for our own interest, being it for NATO or EU, raising of understanding and awareness. But we also have to be realistic about the way that this is happening and make people, our society, resilient and aware of that, and look maybe for the ways how to address it through the trainings, through the awareness campaigns, or through institutional settings that I think need to be adapted to better address these also kind of newer or growing challenges, be it, for example, in the information space.
Thank you, Dr. Kowalczykova. And you are absolutely right that we are living times that may be confusing. However, I regret that our times together is coming to an end. I want to thank you once again for your time and for the great opportunity of interviewing you. I must say that I really enjoyed this heartfelt conversation, and it had been a long, long time. And thank you for telling us young professionals and scholars doing to guarantee her safety and security today and going forwards to 2030. I will now leave the floor to the next panel. Thank you. Bye.
5, 5, 7, 2, 1.
Hi, I'm Lisa Hommel. I'm the Project Officer for the Center of Excellence Engagement Initiative at Atlantic Forum.
Hi, I'm Igor Meheim. I'm one of the co-founders of the Atlantic Forum and also its Partnerships Director. Among other things, I work with other organizations and associations to strengthen transatlanticism.
Hi, I'm Marie and I'm Community Manager in Atlantic Forum.
My name is Elena Petrescu and I'm a Community Manager at Atlantic Forum.
Hi, I'm Megan Gislin and I'm the editor of Atlantica magazine for the Atlantic Forum.
Hello again, everyone. We in Atlantic Forum know that breaks are really important for acquisition of new knowledge and skills. Therefore, we don't want to steal your 10 minutes break right now, but we want to fill it with even more background knowledge dedicated to our work. I am here now with John Jacobs, who is co-founder of Atlantic Forum, and who will tell you even more than you already know about us. Hi, John.
Hi, Marie. How are you?
Thank you, John. I am fine. Enjoying an outstanding conference full of interesting people from around the world and complex backgrounds. How about you?
Yes, this is a wonderful opportunity to be here today and listen to this brilliant combination of young professionals and high-level speakers.
Yes, that is very true. Can you tell us more about yourself and how you and Igor came up with an idea to launch Atlantic Forum?
Right, so in late 2018, Igor and I had retired from our position as respectively IATA President and Vice President, but it quickly left a void. We still had so many things that we thought we could do to engage with youth. And so within a couple of months, we were back on the drawing board trying to figure out how to promote NATO and transatlanticism among our generation, building forward on our experience with IATA. And out of this came the Atlantic Forum, IATA 2.0 if you will. And it started out as two guys in a Twitter account during NATO Engages in Washington back in 2019, and has grown out to be a wonderful network of young professionals being able to independently set up a conference like this 2 years after.
Wow, that's impressive. We also have so many projects going on right now. Can you tell us more about Championship of Transatlantic Youth?
Sure. So this project came from the quote, "If I could, I would replace 30% of my staff with young professionals," which was said by retiring Admiral Manfred Nielsen, the former Deputy Supreme Allied Commander for Transformation in Norfolk. And he mentioned this during both NATO Engages, and he repeated himself again at the GlobeSec Guild interaction, where we had young professionals and him together on the stage. The fact is that nearly every NATO member country has one or two well-known young leader programs that offer a dedicated young leadership program, and every year more than 1,000 young people get introduced to transatlanticism in this way. And yet there's still room for improvement, because what happens after the program has ended? So with the Champions of Transatlantic Youth project, we seek to play into this gap by using funds raised for corporate sponsors or individual sponsorship to provide patronage to alumni of these programs. It's a quadruple win. Now, the main force behind this is Irma Zukauskaite, a brilliant young professional from Lithuania who's coordinating the CODE initiative. So if you work for a government institution or corporation and you're interested in sponsoring youth activities, or you are an individual who wants to sponsor a specific audience, say young female researchers or youth in the Balkans, NATO PFP countries, you name it, then please get in touch with us and send us an email.
That is pretty inspiring. I would join right away. Moreover, we also have our online magazine Atlantica, which is an amazing project. I remember that I struggled so much with publishing articles when I was at the university, and unfortunately, the university did not have a journal to publish my articles. Then I got into a vicious cycle. It was either I had to have good networks to pay journals to publish my articles. So how does it work with Atlantica?
Right, so that's pretty easy, and thanks to Megan Gislin, who is Atlantica's editor, The organization is also very smooth. We have a call for papers each month on NATO hot topics, and then we publish up to 3 articles on different sub-themes on this NATO PD sponsored e-magazine. And of course, the €35 stipend that our patrons can earn is really motivational as well. So if you're not a patron yet, it's an easy way to become a patron for free. And if you're already a patron, you can earn back your patronage.
I love that idea. When you are talking about partnership, can you tell us how people can become our patron and what benefits can they get?
Sure. We try to do it as an entertaining way as possible with added value to our patrons. In a way that they can earn money from the contribution, for example. Atlantica, which you just mentioned, but also with our Academy project. And then they can get involved with other projects as well, like this conference, and meet with other people, with peers. Now, unfortunately, this is only virtual at this moment, but in normal times also physical. So first, there is this direct involvement opportunity that you're literally become part of our team as a volunteer. In some cases, depending on funding, we're able to pay a small allowance. Secondly, you can publish with us in Atlantica, as I already mentioned, a real stepping stone for journalistic work. And we can amplify on our program your articles that were written on transatlantic issues through our views. Fourth, we always listen to your voice. I think that's a core part of the Atlantic Forum. If you have any ideas about a specific project, share it with us and we'll do our best to realize it. All projects that we're currently running start with a patrons emailing us saying like, hey, I want to do X, Y, Z.
Amazing. That is a lot inside €35 package of patronship.
I know, right?
So guys, you should not hesitate to go on our website right now during your break because you don't want to miss any of our speakers during conference time. So you should jump headlong to become a patron button right now.
I totally support that idea. Also, we should not forget our other projects such as the newly launched franchise currently developing in Canada, the US, Greece, Turkey, the Physical 4 and our sort of home in Belgium, in order to create sub-branches or chapters, if you will. The high school program and the upcoming counter-disinformation programs in our academy, overseen by Jelle Jochem, and our involvement with NATO Center of Excellence, coordinated by Lisa Hummel.
It was a really comprehensive discussion with you, John. I hope that our audience got more insight to who we are and what we do.
Yes, I hope so as well, because at the end, hashtag we're all NATO. Thank you, Marie. See you soon.
Thank you, John, and see you soon.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Petra Cicvaric, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to the second panel of the Atlantic Forum's Spring Conference. Thank you to each and every one of you for being here with us this weekend. We're very pleased to be able to welcome those of you that have been with us for a long time now, as well as those who are new to Atlantic Forum and those that might join us. As you already know, this conference marks the 72nd NATO anniversary and the 2nd anniversary of the Atlantic Forum, and we are proud to be able to celebrate them all today with you. In recent times, it has become a truism to think and to say that we live in exceptionally unstable times. Both for our security and well-being, the world seems to be as unpredictable as it has ever been. The challenges that arose with the COVID-19 pandemic have forever changed the way we see one another and the world around us. But despite the social distancing, it has also brought us as allies and partners closer. Therefore, tonight we will tackle NATO's external relations and further focus on how the alliance can advance its strategic interests while also discussing the women, peace and security agenda. Namely, for NATO to advance its strategic interests around the world, it needs to create constructive, like-minded partnerships that will support and drive its goals at the global stage. The panel will explore how NATO engages with its international partners and accelerates to achieve its goals. In this discussion, at first glance, gender may appear to have little to contribute, since security studies are traditionally associated with realist schools of thought. However, the injection of gender promises to open two key areas of understanding that are relatively new now. Namely, it locates women as a group within security studies, and by giving this gender awareness a political edge in a form of feminist international relations theory. However, it is important to stress that gender international relations is not to be restricted to the biological gender, but rather the classification to two genders is a result of a cultural act of construction. Gender is therefore not part of the natural process, but is a discursive construct. What it means is that it categorizes if a man and woman are the result of a web of language, knowledge, power, which established relatively small biological differences into major criteria for social relations. Therefore, feminism as a critical theory challenges our fundamental understanding of security, a conceptual shift opening the field to ideas traditionally associated with the female. It will be emotional, interpersonal, spontaneous, and even unstructured. Since NATO, as an intergovernmental military alliance committed to international peace, sees the integration of gender perspective as one of the methods to improve operational effectiveness and to help provide the most appropriate response to crises, it does not simply suffice to uncover the androcentrism of mainstream. Therefore, this panel will, among topics of engagement with international partners, look at the general contribution feminist analysis can make. Why is there the need for a gender-aware analysis? What are feminist security concerns? And how does feminist IR school look at security studies? To explore these topics, I have a great pleasure to welcome the following speakers. Mrs. Claire Hutchinson took office as the NATO Secretary General's Special Representative for Women, Peace and Security in January 2018. She's a high-level focal point on all aspects of NATO's contribution to the women, peace and security agenda, with the aim to facilitate coordination and consistency in NATO's policies and activities, and to take forward implementation of the EAC policy action plan. Mrs. Hutchinson worked as a senior general advisor with the United Nations for over a decade. She is instrumental in making the strategic development of women peace and security, the development of peacekeeping in Kosovo. Mrs. Hutchinson is a champion of women's issues, working with women for many years and supporting women. The lady tonight with us on the panel is Corey Flasser. She's a national security policy analyst with Booz Allen Hamilton. She currently supports the Joint Chiefs of technical subject matter expertise on implementing the U.S. Women and Peace Security Act within military strategy, plans, and policy. For she is a gender advisor to the U.S. the U.S. Women and Peace Security legislation. steering and operations planner, for special operations Command Europe and Special Operations Command Africa. Coordinated leader and young leader. Our two gentlemen were who is the Action in the Operations Division of NATO and a retired Admiral of British Army. He is also the and cost of NATO and was the Chief of Strategic Policy. Responsible for all operations planning the first and secretary for the presidential elections in 2004. Last but was appointed as president of the University of has been Mrs. Fletcher, Mrs. Button, thank you very much for be here with us this evening and wish you the Atlantic Forum. Please send us in the comment sections. And I would like to suggest that all following our discussion and